British Prime Minister Boris Johnson remains in intensive care after his coronavirus symptoms worsened. And these are live pictures of London's St Thomas's Hospital, where Mr Johnson is. His battle with the virus has shaken the British government. The UK is entering what scientists say is likely to be one of the most deadly weeks of the pandemic. More than 5,300 have died in Britain, and the Health Ministry says the peak of fatalities could happen on Easter Sunday. There are more than 50,000 confirmed cases. Messages of support for the British Prime Minister have flooded in from across Britain and the world. The newly appointed leader of the opposition Labour Party has sent his best wishes. Sir Keir Starmer says his party will act as in the national interest and support the government where it can. US President Donald Trump has also sent his best wishes to a very good friend. European leaders and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi have urged him to recover swiftly. Ollie Barrett brings us the latest from London on this. Ollie, what's the latest you've heard about the British Prime Minister's condition?
We have just had an update from Downing Street. Number 10 saying that Boris Johnson was stable overnight, his first night in intensive care. Downing Street saying that Boris Johnson remains in good spirits, is how they're putting it. They've told us that he has continued to receive what they call standard oxygen treatment, but they insist that the Prime Minister is otherwise breathing without assistance and crucially has not been placed, according to Downing Street, on a ventilator or any other type of mechanical support. Downing Street also clarifying to us that Boris Johnson has not been diagnosed with pneumonia. So some updates coming from Number 10, giving a picture of a stable Prime Minister at this point, but clearly still a cause for concern given that he remains in intensive care.
So what does this mean for the UK government then?
Well, Dominic Raab is the man that had been previously identified by Downing Street as the figure in government who would take over the reins in areas of decision-making from Boris Johnson were he to be incapacitated in some way. That has now come to pass. And Boris Johnson has asked Dominic Raab to take control and take decisions where necessary. Now, that doesn't mean that he is fully in charge of government on his own. He will be having support from other senior cabinet members. He does not, for example, have the power to hire and fire members of the government, but he will be able to make some decisions, if required, around areas, for example, like national security, we are told by Downing Street. But we've also now heard who the successor to Dominic Raab would be were he to become seriously ill. Now that he's moved into that de facto top job while Boris Johnson's in intensive care, we're now told that Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, would be next into that position if Dominic Raab were incapacitated.
Ollie, one last question for you. Austria and Denmark are the first in Europe to announce easing of lockdown restrictions. Is that too soon?
We won't know for many months whether it's too soon. I think it's fair to say we are still watching a lot of these trajectories in terms of European outbreaks, and it'll be some time before we know which government's got this wrong, which government's got it right. One of the things to look at with Austria and Denmark is whether their lifting of restrictions leads to a second peak in the outbreak. That is one thing that many European countries are very worried about indeed. In a sense, the advantage that countries like Britain now have is that they're slightly behind the curve on all of this in terms of the trajectory of the outbreaks in their country. So the UK will be watching Austria and Denmark and other countries that may be close behind, maybe even Italy, to see how the unwinding of some of these restrictions works or doesn't work, as the case may be.
All right, Mayor, thanks for that update. Ollie Barrett speaking to us from London.